Hey guys, I was thinking this weekend about our classroom discussions in regard to the different factors that influence political attitudes. And I was thinking that maybe it would be a good idea for me to come on and record a video of me talking about those factors again because we talked pretty fast in class and I kind of let you just shout those out. And so I want to make sure that you get those under control and that you understand not just that gender is a factor, but what does that really mean? What demographic group tends to vote in a certain way? And I had said a few times that the different videos that you saw or you were supposed to watch for homework did a really good job of identifying those trends. But I want to make sure that I'm able to talk clearly to you about that as well. So one of the things is that when pollsters divide groups up, they know that when they put them into random samples of just going throughout the street, going at the mall, hanging out, finding people, and just taking samples from people. They know that a well-proven fact is that group identification or the way that people kind of identify themselves, they often influence political attitudes. And those political attitudes are shaped by socialization. So the different ways that we're socialized through our friends, our family, our coworkers, other group associations, that ends up converting into some type of political attitude or political understanding of who we are. We're going to talk next unit more about how the media has affected that and how the media kind of molds our political attitudes, but it is a definite, and even today considerably, arguably, I guess, one of the biggest contributions to our political attitudes and in our political socialization. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. What I want to talk about with you are the main factors, which would be family, gender, religion, education, social class, race, and ethnicity, and then region. And then we didn't talk too much about region, so I want to make sure that we get that covered. With family, this would be the number one and most important source of political socialization, and it also plays a major role in shaping our political attitudes, particularly if our parents are a part of a particular party. This begins early in life, by the age of around 10 or so, and throughout or after that age, we might become more independent, or we might decide to stick with what our parents' political attitudes were, or you might go through a stage of rebellion. And we talked in class about how it's not very common to see someone go from one party to the other compared to their parents. A lot of times you see maybe a shift to independent instead of completely going to the polar opposite. Logically, the more politically active your family is, the more likely that you're going to be politically active and even have those same beliefs. So, for example, if you think about the Kennedy family or the Bush family, the Kennedys were always Democrats, the Bushes were mostly Republicans, and the relationship becomes weaker on specific issues. So you might have some variety when it comes to things like gun control or prayer in school or even government welfare programs. But as far as the overall political view, socialization within the family tends to be pretty strong. The second factor that we'll talk about is gender, and a person's gender also influences their political views. For example, more women consider sexual harassment in the workplace to be a serious problem than do men, and more men than women tend to support military actions or spending on foreign affairs. And so we can see a line that's kind of drawn in some particular issues. Party identification has been affected by gender, but the relationship has shifted through the years. So in the 1920s, when women first had the right to vote through hopefully you remember the amendment, that's right, the 19th Amendment, they were more likely to support the Republican Party than were men. And some experts have explained this correlation by pointing out that it was the Republican Party that tended to be more of the hearth and home party in the 1920s. But whatever the explanation is, the tendency for women to vote Republican has continued throughout United States history through the 30s. A lot of women did support Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, over his Republican Party, but the percentage of women supporters was lower than the percentage of men who supported Roosevelt, if that makes sense. So the trend of women supporting the Republican Party held all the way up into the late 1960s, when that correlation basically reversed. And since that time, women have been more likely to vote for the Democratic Party instead. This gender gap, make sure that you know what that means, this gender gap has been explained by the advent or the arrival of modern women's rights movement, the Democrats' tendency to support the points of view that women might support in regard to pro-choice, equal opportunity for women, welfare programs, etc. Now, on the other hand, some experts will argue that Republicans are more concerned about defense issues and they attract more men into their party because of that. But in the election act of 2004, the gender gap appeared to be closing a little bit, the 2004 election. And that was with the president, the candidate, George W. Bush, and he got about 48% of all women's votes. More recent gender gap or gender-related issue has come to deal with men versus women support for women political candidates, and that's a whole other conversation that we can have. But women's numbers in elections have increased. More women candidates are running as Democrats now than as Republicans, and so it's difficult to know if candidates' gender alone really affects the voting patterns of women versus men. But there's a little primer on the gender gap. Something that's somewhat related to that, I guess, is a demographic or a typology that we did not discuss in class, and that would be married versus unmarried. And there is an apparent gender gap, a gender gap. I said that right. A gender gap, especially as evidenced in the 2004 election. But it's not nearly as significant between the gap between the married and unmarried. Let me say that again. There is definitely a gender gap, as I just said, but it's not nearly as significant as the gap that we see between married and unmarried voters. Hopefully I came across clear on that one. If I didn't, just shout at me in class. There was a specific researcher actually that found that on most issues, single and married voters were often as much as 25 to 30 points different in the way that they approach those issues. With singles more likely to vote for Democratic candidates and married voters more likely to vote for Republican candidates. So keep that in mind. Okay, now the issue or the factor of religion. This is one that we did discuss a little bit in class. And an individual's religion is definitely a factor in determining his or her political attitudes. Now, keep in mind that when I'm saying this, these are generalizations, and there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And because there's so many different factors, it's hard to say that all people that fit this mold are going to vote this way, because this is a very layered and complex conversation. But these relationships, as far as religion go, today in 2013 are not as strong as they were in the past, but there still are some patterns that hold. For example, Protestants are more conservative usually, and especially on economic issues, such as minimum wage, taxes, etc., than Catholics or Jews would be. Jews are going to be more liberal, both economic and social, such as civil liberties, civil rights, than you would see with Catholics or Protestants. And then with Catholics, you're going to see that Catholics tend to be more liberal on economic issues than they would be on social issues. Some research today has shown that fundamental Christians tend to support more conservative candidates than for public office. And you see this evangelical Christian voting bloc or voting group really starting to take hold in the late 1990s, even some in the 80s with the Christian Coalition. But even into the early 2000s, you see this as being a very, very, very influential voting group. If you can get that group to vote one way, you're going to see a lot of candidates start to try to appeal to that voting group or that demographic. So these evangelical Christians, Protestant Christians, as the bigger group, are going to vote most typically for Republican Party than for the Democratic Party. This is a more conservative tendency. It's stronger when it comes to social issues such as abortion, such as civil rights for minorities, women's rights, than it is for foreign affairs and economic issues such as government services and jobs guaranteed by the government. In recent elections, there's been a distinction or a clear cut between the political attitudes of those that attend religious services regularly and those people that don't. So even within religious beliefs, you start to see a teasing out or a separation between people that consistently go and people that don't. And the trend was particularly apparent in the 2004 election, when churchgoers were more likely to vote for Republicans than non-churchgoers, who were more likely to vote for Democrats. When it comes to the factor of education, when it comes to the factor of education, a person's level of education also affects their political attitudes. And I said in class that that makes sense, because the more educated you are, possibly the more informed you are about issues, which means that you might be more willing to participate in the election process or at least finding out more about your the candidates that are running for office. But the evidence provides conflicting results. So in general, the higher a person's educational level, the more likely they are to hold more conservative political views. However, many studies have shown that a college education often influences the person's point of view, and so a college education, as far as economic attitudes, could shift a little bit more towards a liberal perspective. Studies also show that the longer students stay in college, the more prestigious the college institution is. So the longer they're there and the more prestigious the college institution is, the more liberal that person's political perspective is. So you see some differences there, and that's why I mean that the studies seem to conflict a little bit. But just know that the more someone is in college, the higher the education, the more they're going to participate. With social class, this is one that I don't think that we discussed in class. A number of years ago, the relationship between social class and political attitudes was very, very clear. The higher the social class, the more conservative the individual, the more likely the person was going to vote for the Republican Party. Now today, it's different. The relationship is much less clear. And perhaps this is because the correlation cited between college education and liberalism, as I just discussed, seems to kind of be blurred a little bit. So even though the broad affiliations between blue-collar workers, make sure I throw that word out there, blue-collar workers, these would be your jobs that you might think blue-collar is like a garage worker. You think of the blue-collar shirt that they wear. With the Democratic Party, that was usually the way those two groups would line up, blue-collar, Democratic Party. Then you'd have businessmen, you'd have white-collar, think of bankers and lawyers. They would line up with the Republican Party. And these relationships still have some credibility, but they're much weaker than they once were. Today we have what's called gray-collar workers, so these would be the folks that are kind of in between. There's also another category called green-collar workers, and so these are folks that have more environmentally friendly jobs. The gray-collar workers, they could possibly go with either party. With the green-collar workers, who do you think they're going to go with? Waiting for your answer there. Typically, they're going to side more with liberal perspectives, with environmentally friendly perspectives, the Democratic Party. Okay, race and ethnicity, this is one that we did discuss in class, and a lot of research is focused on the relationship between a person's race, their ethnicity, and their political attitudes. And so this one is going to be pretty clear in general, but once you start breaking down specific ethnic groups, it is going to go back and forth a little bit. So the oldest and largest numbers of studies, as far as the United States has been on the former slaves, and then descendants of former slaves with black Americans who tend to identify themselves with the Democratic Party today. This is consistently still the most liberal group within the party. Make sure you heard what I just said. The African American group within the United States politics tends to be the most liberal voters within the Democratic Party. In the recent presidential elections, the black vote has voted in overwhelmingly, close to about 90%, for the Democratic Party, or the Democratic candidate. Now, much less research has been conducted on Hispanic Americans, but this is an emerging group as well. The preliminary results, the early results of what we're seeing, indicate that they too to be more liberal than the majority, with a tendency to affiliate with the Democratic Party, but the correlation appears to be much weaker than it does when compared to black voters. A very limited amount of research among Asian Americans indicates that they're more conservative than blacks or Hispanics, but the attitudes of various nationalities within Asians do fluctuate a lot. Asia is a big continent. You have lots of different voting groups within that, so it wouldn't be really fair to say that all Asians vote in a certain way. For example, early research indicates that Korean Americans are more liberal than Japanese Americans. But overall, Asian Americans who voted in the 2000 presidential election voted more often for the Democratic candidate Al Gore than for the Republican candidate George W. Bush. And so the influence of Asian Americans on United States voting is still not very clear. Going back to Hispanic Americans, as you saw in your JANDA readings, there is a division. Even though overall most Hispanics would vote for the Democratic candidate, you do see a difference when considering or when looking specifically at Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans tend to vote more conservatively for the Republican candidate. Excuse me, Cubans. You can see that in your JANDA reading. All right, now this is the last factor. This is the one that we did not talk about in class, and this would be geographic region. As a general rule, people on either coast tend to be more liberal than those in the middle of the country. And there's a funny little map that I'll show you in class, a graphic political cartoon that indicates this. But if you think east and west coast, especially around the northeast of the United States and the southwestern part of the United States, these tend to be liberal voting blocks. So, for example, many Californians could be conservative, but the reason that the trend is probably the stereotype of Californians being more liberal and people from New York being more liberal, people from Massachusetts being more liberal, is that those urban areas have a lot of voters. So the state overall might take one demographic or one political ideology. You might see them voting for a Republican governor, but the cities, because they have more populated areas, might make you think that state is more liberal than it actually is. There's a reversal of that too that we'll talk about. Anyway, cities in the Rust Belt around the Great Lakes. We talked about Detroit in Michigan. We talked about those other states that are kind of around the Great Lakes. The Rust Belt tend to be more democratic because they have very, very strong labor unions. So just keep that in mind. The Southeast presents some problems applying this rule because you have party affiliations of Southeasterners that have started to change, have been changing over the past 50 years or so. So since the 1950s, a lot of Southerners have broken their traditional ties with the Democratic Party. If you think about if you have a grandparent or great-grandparent, and I'd said this in class, who lives in the South and have always lived in the South, and as they talk about their political ideologies, if you hear them and you think that does not sound like a very liberal stance on these different issues, but they still vote for the Democratic Party, that's because those party affiliations in the Southeast have been so strong that a lot of times people who've been voting for many decades have continued to side with the party of their childhood or their early adulthood. So virtually all representatives in the Southeast, senators, governors, local officials in the South, at one time belonged to the Democratic Party. But since the 1950s, more and more of the political leaders have been affiliated with the Republican Party. And so in most southern states, both parties now will have viable contenders for the different offices. Some experts explain this phenomenon by saying that many Southerners disagreed with the Democratic Party for support for black or civil rights during the 1950s, and so the result was that many white Southerners changed their party affiliation, and then now after the last 50 years, there's been kind of a migration away from that. So there you have your demographic, or your, I should say, geographic factor as far as most liberal voters, or if you think of blue states being on the coast, most of the Sun Belt, most of the Bible Belt in the South, and the Midwest would be more red states, except for the Rust Belt, when you see a lot more blue states in there. And we'll look at some past presidential electoral college maps, and you'll see these trends pop up as far as who those states cast their electoral votes for. Okay, so I hope that this was valuable to you. I hope that you can maybe pause this and jot down some notes and get in your mind a clear indication of the types of trends that we see with the different demographic the different demographic voters in the United States. If you have any questions about anything that I said, if I said something in reverse and misspoke, make sure that you point that out to me in class, and we'll talk about any questions that you have. I will see you guys later.